So I had this idea for a market strategy. It involves entrepreneurialism and squashing monopolistic behavior. And it's kind of strange because I think in an entrepreneurial manner, which I think to mean that one thinks in terms of market opportunities rather than just merely like business management and risk minimization, that sort of thing. Risk minimization can be in market opportunity, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. I think entrepreneurialism is a way of thinking. The way of thinking entrepreneurially leads to kind of the creation of markets, of recognizing where in the existing markets there's some gap in something that can be provided, some latent assumptions that aren't being developed, or anyway, making new markets. And so this behavior more than likely leads into the creation of new markets. And so when you create a new market, there's only one player initially, and that would technically be monopoly behavior, monopolistic behavior. And in neoclassical economics, there's the idea of a perfectly competitive market. And in that condition, there's tons of suppliers. It is not a monopolistic market. There is not a monopoly. And there's so many suppliers that the price is like at the perfect point. The price in the long run, price is at the perfect point where it's equal. The amount of stuff that's being supplied is equal to the amount of stuff that's being demanded, and under these conditions, the total benefits that society derives from this are maximized, supposedly. And so I'm like, well, that sounds like a pretty solid deal. Problem is, that requires a lot of firms, right? Providing the most benefits to society. That sounds great, So how do you get from the position of, in my case, thinking entrepreneurially, potentially creating new markets, to creating new markets where monopolistic behavior plays out, where a monopoly might be created. And mind you, when there is monopoly, if you don't know, there's a loss to society. Society has it experiences an inefficiency in terms of resource allocation and stuff. So it's inefficient, and society loses out on benefits that it would derive. It would be able to get, supposedly, from a perfectly competitive market. So I'm in the position of someone who might want to create new markets, and I know that there's this issue of monopolistic behavior emerging, which leads to society losing out on benefits that it could derive if there was a perfectly competitive market structure. Profits are higher, though, per firm, in a monopolistically competitive situation, especially for when there is just a monopoly. Monopolistically competitive just means that it's between the situation where there's a bunch of firms and there's only one firm, or only a few firms, and each firm is a business, really. It's just a term that economists use for some reason. Anyway, so I'm in this position of saying, well, okay, if the things that I want to do, that I'm inclined to do, lead to this, to society losing out on these benefits, how could this kind of loss of benefits be dampened, be reduced to the most minimum that it can as quickly as possible? So how could I rapidly go from monopolistically competitive, from having a monopoly to being monopolistically competitive, where there's more than one firm providing goods to the market, to the point where there's so many firms that they're all, none of them have power over one another, to the point where the benefits that society derives from this market are maximized. So how could you get to that point? Well, I had an idea for it, and then I went to two of my professors to kind of ask them about this thing. And the first one was really funny because he was like, "Wow, you say you're an entrepreneur and stuff, but this is you're a really bad entrepreneur if this is the kind of thinking that you're going, the route you're going down, right? Because, as I said before, in a monopolistic situation, profits are higher. The closer you get to perfectly competitiveness, profits go down. Usually the assumption is people try to maximize profits. And I personally am just not all that interested in profits. I'm much more interested in providing benefits to other people. So long as I can cover my costs, my cost of living and stuff, I really don't care. And that's included in these models of the markets. And anyway, so he's like, wow, you're working up to be a terrible entrepreneur. And so thankfully it wasn't like in an insulty way. He was kind of joking. So then I went to go see my kind of favorite professor here on campus, and just the other day, and I told him this idea. It was like, we're gonna go from being monopolistically competitive, tons of profits, to as low as possible, as quickly as possible. And he was just like, why the hell would you want to do this? And I'm like, that's a good question, and I'm like, let's just say theoretically we wanted to. And then I explained, because of the benefits, maximization and stuff. And so he kind of sat back in his chair for a second, and he's like, Brandon, it depends. It depends. Whether or not the situation in which perfectly competitive markets provide a greater amount of efficiency and stuff to the market, a greater amount of benefits, might actually depend upon whether a monopoly theoretically has greater economies of scale. And so he drew this graph, and I guess I could probably use some twigs. You can probably not see it. Okay, let's see. Yeah, got some twigs. So he's like, okay, so a monopoly can produce at potentially over time at this level. Well, I don't know which way this video is gonna go, so let's just say that this is going down. So its costs are going down over time, the bigger it gets. This isn't always the case. I mean, after a certain increase in size, it'll start to go up again. So overall, it has a bowed kind of cost structure. But for the most part, say that for a long time, its costs are just going down. So this is one of the big things with monopolies. The bigger you get, the lower your cost can get. So then he's like, so then let's see the perfectly competitive result. And then the costs are up here, and you can kind of imagine. So the graph kind of looked like this, unfortunately. So even though there's the perfectly competitive like result right here, up here, and all of these firms, there's just tons of firms, and they all look like, let's just use like these little leaves. So they all have these individual little cost structures, and they're all bowed, kind of like the monopoly one. The problem is that they're so small that they can't keep their costs down, right? And so they all constitute, like they all run across this line. They're all competing with each other, and because they're competing with each other, there's inefficiency. And so the process of competition itself might be so inefficient that it might actually raise the price. So this is the monopoly situation, right? Costs are going down, and so then the cost structure might actually be raised the more by the more people that enter the market, which is a real damper on my idea of kind of like almost like a market martyr. So like some benevolent firm that for some reason doesn't want to extract hella profit, and they just want to give tons of benefit to the society. So he told me this, and the idea is that he did say that it depends. So it's not always going to be the case that the cost structure goes down and that the price is always going to be up really high. It's not always going to be that way, but sometimes it is. And in fact, he kind of made it sound like it kind of often is the case that the competition actually leads to a lot of inefficiency that leads to this being actually less efficient and beneficial to society. Anyway, but I would really like to quickly go over my strategy thing. So the strategy is very interesting. So say that you're, initially the monopoly guy. You're the first guy into the market because you've created the market essentially. And the only reason why I see some firm coming along that might not want to extract as much profit as possible is actually if they're a religious firm. If they're run, it's not okay. So it's not the only reason, but it's one of the more reasonable reasons that I can kind of see for why a firm wouldn't want to extract tons of profit. If they're religious, hopefully they want to provide benefits to the community, to the world, that sort of thing. So what they would do is, they have a cost structure that's really low, and so what they would do is they would keep restricting the amount of quantity that other firms can produce in this market. So and then we learned this in one of my classes that deals with game theory, where what you can do if you're a monopoly, which is real devious. And I really don't like it because you have a lot of power over the rest of the market. But okay. So monopolies, when they have power over the market, they tend to be regulated, especially here in the U.S. And maybe in other countries. I don't know. They tend to be regulated because they wield a lot of power over the market in general and in terms of raising prices. But I don't think that this strategy would be regulated because my intention is to lower prices, potentially. So what it is where you as the monopolist restrict the amount of quantity that can be produced. So say this is 0, and then quantity runs on the axis like right here, right? So if you restrict the amount of quantity that you can pump out into the market, and there's enough demand for a higher quantity amount, then competitors can come into the market and they can provide the residual, the leftover demand. They can provide the quantity demanded that's left over that you haven't provided yourself. And there's a whole game theory thing about this. It's called Stackelberg quantity leadership. Yeah. So if you lead on quantity, you leave this residual demand, and so you would need a lot of things to be going right for this to work. But so if you keep letting firms deal with like small, ever more levels of quantity, and kind of tinkering with your cost structure such that they can kind of keep up with it in a competitive way, in a competitive cost covering way, then you might be able to wield so much power to some degree over the market that you can limit the size of your would-be competitors, but at the same time incentivize people to enter the market. Whereas the traditional monopoly the traditional monopolies discourage entrance into the market by raising prices, restricting quantity and stuff, restricting quantity or over-providing quantity, not allow people to come in and make enough money. This sort of firm, which I deem like a market martyr, would be weirdly benevolent and lose out on profits left and right, so that the market approaches a perfectly competitive structure. If the second professor that I went to, my favorite professor here, was right about the structure that would result from this, then society would actually maybe lose out on benefits, despite the market structure potentially approaching perfectly competitiveness. But at the same time, this idea is highly theoretical and likely wouldn't work at all, because it would somewhat require perfect information about the cost structure that your would-be competitors are working with, full information about technology, marginal cost information especially, and just the ability to time your increases in quantity and decreases at the correct way. And there's the assumption that you're able to change your marginal costs you're more flexible in your operations than any of your potential competitors, which is ridiculous. And so this is like a huge thought experiment, a lot of fun though, and I do not know enough math or game theory stuff to model much of this thing. I really came up with this when I was going over Stackelberg, and it was a lot of fun. But I think the notion that you can totally have a highly powerful monopoly in a market that weirdly doesn't have power over the market itself necessarily, but rather over the providers in that market, is very fascinating, because it's just kind of like a different form of market power than I think that we're used to thinking about. And this sort of firm, the market martyr, is all the while reducing their market power. They're kind of working so that they can very calculatedly defer their market power to other entities, other firms, other persons. And that's very interesting. We don't see that enough. If anything, firms, businesses, they're very interested in seemingly gobbling up everything, controlling everything. And the notion that a firm would be dialing back, kind of letting other people not take the reins of the market necessarily, but rather, you know, like delegating some of the market to other people. I admit that sounds a lot like collusion, and maybe it is to some degree, especially when it leads to less competitive markets and higher prices and these different things. But so in my class, I'm thinking that what I'm kind of working at here is that we've gone over collusion and monopolies and oligopolies and how they collude, which means to just work together to kind of reduce competition in the marketplace. We've gone over that in my class, but we haven't gone over how collusion, some collaborativeness, might actually lead to increased competition, and why that would be desired. I don't know why a firm exactly would really desire additional competition, especially if, right, just to look at that graph, you know, again. Oh, this is really pretty. You know, to look at that graph again, right? Cost structure, boom, you know, from a monopoly, and then up here from perfectly competitiveness. We're up here, you know, due to the competition, right? Due to the inefficiency with the competition. So why society would want that? I don't know, but maybe they would benefit from just the sense that, oh, okay, one firm, 1, 2, 3, you know, some small number of firms doesn't have complete power over this market. Maybe they're willing to pay, to bear the costs associated with having the price levels be at, you know, this higher level versus, you know, this is bending the wrong way. This thing's like a spiral now. Okay, so versus, right, so maybe people would be willing to bear the costs associated with operating at this level, simply because then one firm or a few firms don't have such dramatic power over the markets, power over their lives, essentially. And that's very interesting. We haven't gone into that. I don't know if that would be termed externalities, if that would be counted as externalities. But I think that'd be a really cool thing to look into. Anyway, so that's an idea that I've been working with. I've been really rambling. I hope that I didn't go over people's heads too much. So I had a fun, cool idea. It's highly theoretical, highly impractical, probably will never happen, but it's a lot of fun to think about. See you guys. Have a great day. It's really beautiful here. This is Sacramento State University. Woo! Yeah. It's fall. There's leaves everywhere. It's beautiful. See you guys. Have a good day. Bye-bye.